Tantor Audio, a division of recorded books, presents The Haunting Season, 8 Ghostly Tales for Long Winter Nights, by Bridget Collins, Natasha Pulley, Kieran Millwood Hargrave, Elizabeth MacNeil, Laura Purcell, Andrew Michael Hurley, Jess Kidd, and Imogen Hermes Gower. Narrated by Juliet Stevenson, Rosalind Eleazar, Rory Kinnear, and Gemma Whelan.
A Study in Black and White by Bridget Collins. Perhaps if Morton had not stopped to mop his brow in that precise spot, he might never have noticed the black and white house. As it was, he had just replaced his cap and swung his foot over the crossbar of his bicycle when he caught sight of the wrought iron gate in the wall and, beyond, a fleeting impression of light and dark. So brief that he hardly knew what he'd seen, only that it prompted him to maneuver sideways, half-perched on the saddle, and peer between the metal bars. Through the clouds of his breath, he saw a house of a familiar type, ancient and half-timbered, surrounded by a sparse, formal garden. It was like a pen-and-ink sketch. The narrow timbers of the house, the wintry drive white with hoar-frost, the clipped symmetry of the yews and their long shadows. But the other similar houses he'd seen were ramshackle, their gables leaning sideways or tipped forward, sagging with the weight of centuries. This one was upright, its lines straight and its angles true, and yet it was not, to all appearances, a new house. Morton regarded it at length. He enjoyed order, rules, and discipline. This house, with its refusal to compromise, its apparent mastery over the forces of gravity and time, met with his approval. He stood for a long time, staring through the bars of the gate. It was peculiarly quiet. The place reminded him of something, but it wasn't until he had, at last, wrenched himself away and pedalled a little way down the road that he realized what it was. And only then, because in glancing back, he saw the house from another direction, where more rows of topiary stood on either side of a wide lawn. These trees were cut into elaborate, familiar shapes. Rooks, knights, bishops, king and queen, and in front of them the long ranks of pawns. On a summer day the effect might have been playful. As it was, in the cold stillness, it was sombre, arresting. Morton and his bicycle wobbled, and he fought to regain his balance as he rounded the corner. Yes, that was it. The house had put him in mind of a chess set. A box of pieces, a flat board, the monochrome pattern of frost and shadow. It was a coincidence that he had thought so before he saw the topiary, unless the owner of the house had had the same fancy and designed the garden accordingly. Or, no, Morton thought, he must have caught a subconscious glimpse of the trees through a gap in the wall and made the association without realizing. No doubt that was it. He bent over his handlebars and pedalled harder, resisting the impulse to turn back. At first he seemed to feel the house recede into the distance, as though every turn of the wheels took an extra effort. But after a few minutes he encountered a most demanding hill, and the exertion required drove everything else out of his head. The sun rose higher, flashing into his eyes above the trees. He grew pleasantly warm, and then hungry. His itinerary brought him round in a figure of 8, back towards the village where he had planned to stop for lunch at a famous old inn, but the road by which he returned was a different one, and when he finally dismounted at the Swan, he was thinking of nothing but a pint of local beer and a plate of rabbit stew or devilled kidneys. He walked into the bar, divested himself of his cap and gloves, and sat down in front of the fire. It was only then, as he felt a pleasant lassitude creep over him, that the house came back into his mind's eye. He saw again the clipped yews in their ranks, facing one another across the pale lawn, and in his imagination he gave a little push to the Queen's pawn, moving it forward. He had a fondness for chess. He had happy memories of triumphs over his cousins and his sister, who had once, in tears, thrown the board across the room and refused to play ever since. There were few things so satisfying as announcing checkmate, or watching an opponent's resentful finger tip over the king to concede defeat. He still felt the interior glow of his victory in a house match. He'd been playing the captain of the chess club, who had given him a limp, hateful handshake before slinking away in humiliation. Morton had enjoyed that. A woman's voice said, "What'll you have, sir?" Morton blinked and ordered a pint of ale and, after some deliberation, a plate of mutton chops. The food, when it came, was surprisingly good, and half an hour later he was still sitting in his armchair, feeling as satiated and content as he had for some time. Since, indeed, he had left his previous address somewhat precipitously, after a certain little unpleasantness had come to light. It was 15 miles or so back to his boarding house in Ipswich, but he sank deeper into his chair and asked for another pint of beer. When the maid put it in front of him, he said, watching the firelight play in the amber liquid, "Do you happen to know the house just east of here with the chess pieces of topiary?" She hesitated. Surprised, he raised his eyes, just in time to catch a flicker of wariness in her expression. She said, "The black and white house, sir?" "That's the one," he said. Somehow, although surely that description could be applied to hundreds of houses, he was certain that she knew which one he meant. "Yes," she said. There was a silence, and she turned away. This was impertinence. "Who owns it?" Morton said, reaching out. Not that he would actually take hold of her, naturally, but his outstretched hand was enough to make her flinch and halt mid-step. "No one local," she said. "The old man was the last." "But someone must own it, a place like that." She shrugged. "Then who lives there?" "No one at the moment." She bent to wipe the table next to him, avoiding his gaze. An odd spark leapt in Morton's breast. He said, "It's empty, then." She didn't answer, and he took a deep breath, repressing his irritation. They were perhaps unused to educated men in these parts. Presumably they catered more for peasants and farmers. He said more loudly, "I should very much like to see the garden. To visit, I mean." "The gates will be locked, I expect." "Yes, I'm quite aware of that. I simply wondered whether— never mind." He threw himself back in his chair and flapped his hand to dismiss her. She left, with neither an apology nor a backward glance. "That's for rant." Morton gave a start. The voice, a wheedling, desiccated one, had come from a dim corner of the room which until now he had assumed to be empty, but now he saw that there was a figure at a little table there. "I beg your pardon?" he said, leaning forward. "The black and white house," the man said, without moving, so his face remained in darkness. Until that moment, Morton had not realized that the winter sun no longer reached into the room and the afternoon was drawing in. "Forgive me," he went on, "but I couldn't help overhearing. It is handsome property, isn't it?" "It's certainly very striking," Morton said. "If you want to look around, I imagine the agent will be able to show it to you. Letterman, on the square." The man gestured. He had a jerky, awkward manner, as though he was held together with string. "Up by the Guildhall. You'd better hurry. He closes early in winter." Yes, I see." Morton found himself on his feet, although only a moment ago he had been too full and drowsy to move, and most of his beer still stood in its glass. He was glad of this new information, of course, and eager to make inquiries at the letting office. His haste had nothing to do with the man's glinting eyes, or the way the shadows huddled and plotted on the wall behind him. Thank you, he said. Not at all. Good afternoon. Morton fumbled for his cap and gloves, knocking one to the floor. As he bent to retrieve it, he saw that the man was sitting in front of a chessboard. Ah, he said, conscious that his hurry to get away was unseemly. A fellow enthusiast. Yes, the man said, and smiled. You might say that. There was a short silence. Morton might, under other circumstances, have lingered for a while longer to indulge in a little learned chatter regarding, say, the relative merits of King's Pawn and Queen's Pawn openings. Instead, he said, Well, thank you, and hurried outside, glad to feel the door shut behind him and cold air on his face. The letting agent, a little man with spectacles and a threadbare collar, couldn't conceal his surprise at Morton's query, but after the first widening of his eyes, he said, Yes, indeed, yes, and produced a key with great enthusiasm. The black and white house, he said. My goodness, yes, a very reasonable rent, very reasonable. Have you looked at other properties in the area? Morton explained that he had taken a room in a lodging-house in Ipswich, and that, until that day, he had not wanted, it had not even occurred to him, to rent a house. He expected further questions, since, after all, it was hardly a rational position, but after a single twitch of his eyebrows, the agent said, yes, indeed, and reached for his hat. I expect you want to view it. It was closer than Morton had realized, just on the outskirts of the village. But by the time the agent unlocked the gate, the sun had sunk below the trees, and the garden was in shadow. In the gathering twilight, the topiary seemed massive and solid, like black stone. He paused, turning slowly to look at the ranks on either side of him. Black against black, he thought, and the back of his neck prickled. Mr. Morton? The agent said from the doorway. Shall we? Morton shook himself. Excuse me, he said, and hurried forward to lean his bicycle against the wall. As you see, it's fully furnished, the agent said. I understand the current owner takes no interest, so the house is exactly as it was when the old man, yes, well, a little old-fashioned, perhaps, but you could move in immediately. This evening, if you wanted. He gave a little braying laugh. This way, please. It was dark inside. The ceilings were low, and the furniture, which was more than a little old-fashioned, took up so much space that Morton had to weave his way around it as he followed the agent. The rooms were long, with wide, mullioned windows that glowed bluish in the dusk. They went through into a narrow passage, and then up the stairs. The agent said, Here are the bedrooms. But now he was moving quickly, not giving Morton time to look properly. It's getting late, he said, and it's rather gloomy in here. I don't want to rush you, but is there gas? No, lamps still, I'm afraid. Or candles, of course, but it would spoil the charm to have gas, don't you think? His tone belied the words. He turned, manoeuvred past Morton, and went briskly down the stairs. Have you seen enough? Morton hesitated, staring through the open door into the bedroom, where there was a bed with hangings, a looking-glass, a table with twisted barley-sugar legs, a candelabra with wax-shrouded, half-burnt candles. But his attention was caught by the view outside, the massed rows of chess pieces waiting on the lawn. It was hard to wrench his gaze away. Yes, he said. Quite enough. Well then, shall we? The agent gestured with a limp arm. It wouldn't suit everyone, I can see that. These historic places can be oppressive in the winter. I'll take it. And of course... He stopped. Pardon me? I'll take it, Morton repeated. Why were the local people so slow to understand the simplest utterance? I shall have my things brought over tomorrow. Should we go back to your office? I suppose there's something I should sign. Oh, no, plenty of time, whenever you've, settled in, the agent said, stammering. That's, I'm pleased it suits. We'll, sort out the details of the lease at your convenience. Morton nodded. There was a brief silence, then, with a faint incredulity, he realized that the agent was waiting for him so that they could leave together. Well, I'll stay here, he said. It's late to cycle back to my lodgings. I imagine I can dine at the Swan. Certainly, but, you did say I might move in this evening, if I chose. I did, yes. The agent cleared his throat. It's, up to you, naturally, if you're anxious to take possession. He held out the key. Tomorrow morning, then. You know where to find me? And, He shifted from foot to foot, then he added, If you change your mind overnight, we'll say no more about it. I'm sure I'll manage, Morton said. I can get a good fire going in the parlour. Yes. Well, good night, then. The agent gave him a nod and disappeared. Morton heard his footsteps accelerate along the passage and the heavy closing of the front door. He waited until he thought the agent would have had time to make his way along the drive and out into the road. Then he heaved a deep, gratified breath and strode along the passage, feeling the thrill of possession. How unexpected. How miraculous. He could almost laugh at the memory, had it only been this morning, of seeing the house from the road. Now it was his, to explore, to conquer. In the last few moments, night had nearly fallen, so he picked up the candelabra from the table in the bedroom and lit the candles. Then he lifted the candelabra and went from room to room, skirting around clawed-foot chairs and dusty hangings to pick books from shelves and open cabinets and drawers. The agent had called the house furnished, but it was more than that. It gave the impression of having been left untouched, of being abandoned between one chime of the clock and the next. Only one room was in perfect order, a child's bedroom at the back of the house, with a neat shelf of toys, a miniature cricket bat propped in a corner, and, in the window seat, a child-sized chessboard and a pile of books. Morton paused in the doorway. Then he shut the door with more force than he needed and moved on. In every other room, there were traces of the old man. Nothing so obvious as food left uneaten or a half-smoked pipe left on a side table, but the candles, the soap left on the washstand, the towel hung upon a rail. He found a copy of the Chess Player's Chronicle in the parlour, splayed across the arm of the couch, as though the reader had wanted to mark his place. In front of it, in the corner of the room where the shadows gathered, was a chess set arranged for the beginning of a game. It was made of stone, or was it jet and ivory? Morton picked up a pawn, feeling the oil-smooth weight of it, and then replaced it neatly in front of the queen. Later, perhaps, he would find a chess problem in the Chronicle and study it until he was sleepy enough to retire to bed. He always found them easier when he could contemplate the pieces on a real board. He straightened the pawn with the tip of his finger, ensuring that it was exactly in the middle of its square, and then turned away. As he left the room, he had the sudden, irrational sense that he had forgotten something, or made some mistake, like leaving a glass where a careless sleeve would almost certainly catch it, or a window unlatched before a storm. But it was only when he was in the kitchen, taking stock of the dried goods that still remained in the cupboards, that he realized, with a wry smile at his own whimsy, he should, like any polite player, have murmured Jadoub. Footnote. In chess there is a rule that if you touch a piece, you must make a move with it, unless you say Jadoub, literally I adjust, first. It was freezing. The first thing to do was to dull the biting edge of the cold, and as he stared at the enormous unlit range, Morton had to concede that it was not, in fact, the most convenient place to stay the night. But he seemed to remember that on the way here the agent had mentioned a charwoman. No doubt that accounted for the absence of dust and cobwebs, and tomorrow he could make proper arrangements for her to look after him. In the meantime, there was something rather exciting about being here alone, searching in the cupboards for everything he needed. Once, as a child, after some misdemeanor or other, he had hidden for hours, listening with growing pleasure to his mother's voice as she grew worried and then, finally, afraid. He had let her call for a long time before he finally emerged, savouring his power. He didn't know why that came into his head now, but he felt a sort of dry, uncharacteristic grin on his face as he rummaged for old newspapers and kindling, and then knelt to build a fire in the great drawing-room hearth. Once he had got the fire going, he sat back on his knees and drew a deep, satisfied breath. He had meant to go to the inn for dinner, but he wasn't hungry, and now that the fire was lit, he had no inclination to venture out into the bitter night. He stood up, brushed ash from the knees of his trousers, and crossed to the window to draw the curtains. As he drew them across, he paused, struck by the sight of the garden. The moon had risen, tinting the lawn silver, the trees and their shadows a dense black. Under its wintry glare, the whole world was transformed into pearl and ebony. It was otherworldly, alien, and Morton thought he had never seen anything so lovely. But he was not the sort of man to be seduced by anything so intangible as beauty. He closed the curtains with such a decisive jerk that a cloud of dust made him cough and turned back into the room. His eye was caught by a decanter of brandy on the sideboard. He sniffed at it, first gingerly and then exultantly, and poured a generous measure into one of the glasses that sat beside it. Then he settled beside the hearth, leant back on the couch, and presented the soles of his shoes to the fire. He congratulated himself. A house like this, for a minimal rent. The brandy was excellent, the fire was taking the chill out of the air, and after the morning's exercise and the afternoon's unexpected events, he felt almost light-headed. He could feel the heat lapping around his ankles, spreading out into the rest of the room. The crackles of the flames were accompanied by the roar of air in the chimney and the groans of old walls settling. The joists overhead murmured a little as the warm air reached them. As Morton's eyes began to close, he heard a long chain of thuds along the floor approaching him, and he jolted upright, his heart in his mouth, half expecting to see someone there. His eyes took a moment to focus, and, for an instant, he thought he saw a dark blur pass and dissolve into nothing before he could blink. His heart skipped a beat. But of course there was no one. It must have been the wood shifting in the joints between the boards. He'd heard other old houses make noises that were uncannily like voices or footsteps. He relaxed, tried to chuckle, and let his head fall back against the corner of the couch. At the same time, the leather armchair opposite him, across from the chessboard, gave a little sigh, as though someone had settled into it. It was easily explained, even more easily than the floorboards. The air inside the cushion must have expanded and contracted according to some eddy of fire-warmed air. But he couldn't help staring at the chair with narrowed eyes and a foolishly hammering heart. Nothing moved. The leather held the shape of a body. A man, he thought, bony and narrow-hipped, with the habit of leaning his elbows on the padded arms, and, for a fraction of a second, Morton almost saw him there, among the dipping fire shadows. He blinked the image away and took another sip of brandy. The fierce sweetness of it calmed the shiver at the back of his neck. He took a bigger mouthful for luck and shifted his buttocks, trying to find the comfort of a few moments ago. His gaze drifted to the chessboard. The white pawn was out of place. Morton froze. Instead of waiting neatly in line, the pawn had advanced and was standing clear of the others, the Queen's pawn opening. It was impossible. He had replaced it. Hadn't he said to himself, Jadoub? But no, he must have moved it. He had picked it up to feel the weight of it and put it down again. He must have misremembered its position, that was all. It was the most natural thing in the world to set that pawn down in a new position, to begin a game automatically, so automatically it had hardly registered, and then forget, so that now, absurdly staring down at it, he felt stuck, short of breath. He reached out, but his hand stopped above the board, as though he had encountered a pane of glass. He didn't want to touch it. He remembered the heft of it in his palm and the faint greasiness that had made him wonder if it was ivory, not stone. He drew back. Some instinct made him raise his eyes again to the armchair in the shadows, but it was empty, and the contours of the leather were impersonal, after all, just the shape of an old chair imprinted by years of use. The electricity that had tingled in Morton's spine died, leaving only weariness. This was the effect of exertion and excitement, and he glanced at his glass, noting that he had drunk nearly all of his brandy, intemperance. He swallowed the last drops and set the goblet down beside the chessboard. It was time for bed. He slept uneasily. The bedroom was icy, and he had been too squeamish to crawl under the blankets, choosing instead to lie fully dressed on the eiderdown and cover himself with his overcoat. So perhaps it was unsurprising that in his dreams he was back in his dormitory at boarding school, part remembering, part reinventing the endless mischiefs and tricks that he had inflicted on other boys. When he awoke, as soon as he understood where he was, for the vivid aftermath of his dream hung like fog in front of his eyes for a few moments, he thought of coffee, hot shaving water, and the merry fire in the breakfast room of his lodging-house. He cursed. What had possessed him to stay here? Worse, to have agreed to rent the place. He swung himself stiffly off the bed and hobbled into the passage and down the stairs, groaning aloud. But when he passed the window at the head of the staircase, his spirits lifted. The day was as clear as a diamond. The garden was silvery green in the dawn, the topiary a miracle of symmetry. It would, after all, take very little to make this place habitable. Good fires, clean sheets, a delivery of groceries, and the services of some respectable biddy, and then he would be, Morton smiled, the master of all he surveyed. He hurried down the stairs and out into the bright, bracing air. A minute later, he was sailing down the drive on his bicycle, in and out of the shadows of the trees, and then out onto the road that led to the village. And he had a most satisfactory morning. If the agent was taken aback that Morton was still as eager as ever to rent the black and white house, he concealed it admirably and dealt so briskly with the papers that Morton left his office within a quarter of an hour. He even gave Morton the address of the charwoman who was in the habit of dusting the rooms every week or so, and she, with the glint of avarice in her eyes, agreed to provide food for Morton to heat up and to manage his washing and ironing and any other domestic details that might prove necessary. Morton left her cottage and rode along the high street with a light heart, whistling. He had only foreseen a temporary sojourn here, a few months at most, until that unfortunate entanglement at home had blown over, but he might stay here longer, even permanently. He stopped at the post office to send instructions to his lodging-house to have his things delivered. Then he went to break his fast at the inn. This time he sat deliberately on the other side of the room, feeling a mysterious reluctance to encounter the gentleman who had spoken to him previously. But, it being market day, the room was packed with
Sample complete. Ready to continue?